The hospital corridor smelled of disinfectant and resignation. Admiral Marcus Grayson walked with the measured pace of a man who'd attended too many funerals, his dress whites pristine against the sterile walls. He was there for a routine visit, inspecting the military wing of San Diego Naval Medical Center, when he noticed her. She moved differently than the other nurses, economical, precise, like someone conserving energy for a longer war. Her auburn hair was pulled back tight, and her hands worked with mechanical efficiency as she checked IV lines and adjusted monitors. There was something about the way she held herself, spine straight despite obvious exhaustion, that made him pause mid-stride. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying the gentle authority of command. "I don't believe we've met. I'm Admiral Grayson." She glanced up, and for half a second something flickered across her face, recognition, maybe, or memory, before the professional mask returned. "Lieutenant Commander Myra Castellanos, sir, retired." Her voice was steady, almost flat. "I'm just a civilian nurse now." The title caught him off guard. Lieutenant Commander. That wasn't typical for naval nurses unless they'd served in specialized roles. He noticed the small details then. The way she angled her body to keep visual contact with the entire ward, the subtle scan of exits, the weathered quality of her hands that spoke of more than hospital work. Before he could ask the obvious question, a young Marine in the corner bed began to thrash, monitors screaming. She was moving before the sound fully registered, her body responding with combat-trained reflexes that had nothing to do with nursing school. Grayson watched as she stabilized the situation with quiet commands to the arriving staff, her voice never rising above conversational volume even as she worked. When it was over and the Marine was resting peacefully, she returned to her station as if nothing had happened. The Admiral followed. "You have the movements of a pilot," he observed, making it a statement rather than a question. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Had, sir, past tense." "What was your platform?" She hesitated, and in that pause he saw the weight of something enormous. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter. "Super Hornet, carrier-based strike missions. I flew off the Lincoln and the Stennies." That explained the rank. Fighter pilots didn't come out of nowhere, and female carrier pilots were still relatively rare, which meant she'd been exceptional. But none of that explained why she was here, wearing scrubs instead of a flight suit, working double shifts in a place where the screams of wounded men must sound like echoes of another life. "Your call sign?" he asked. She met his eyes then, and he saw something break behind her professional facade. Just for a moment she looked infinitely tired. "Revenant, sir. They called me Revenant." The name hit him like a gut punch, and suddenly he understood exactly who he was talking to. The story began 9 years earlier, over the mountains of Afghanistan where the sky burned copper at dawn. Lieutenant Myra Castellanos, call sign Revenant, was 28 years old and already on her second combat deployment. She flew like someone with nothing to lose, which her squadron mates initially mistook for recklessness. They learned better after Kandahar. Her Super Hornet screamed through valleys at 500 knots, terrain masking so close to the ridgelines that her exhaust left scorch marks on ancient stone. She wasn't reckless. She was surgical. "Revenant, this is Darkstar. You're cleared hot on target Romeo 7. Troops in contact, danger close." The JTAC's voice crackled through her helmet with the clipped urgency of someone watching Americans die. "Copy Darkstar. 20 seconds. Her hands moved across the cockpit with practiced grace, systems check completed before the words finished leaving her mouth. Below her, the terrain rolled past in shades of brown and gray, the Hindu Kush mountains indifferent to the small human dramas playing out in their shadows. She armed the GBU-38, felt the familiar weight shift as the weapon went hot. Target marked. Friendlies 200 meters north. Wind 3 knots east. The JTAC was giving her the impossible math. Drop the bomb close enough to save the patrol, but not so close that she killed the very people she was trying to protect. Roger, 1 pass, 1 kill. It wasn't bravado, it was promise. She rolled inverted, pulled the nose down into a 30-degree dive, and let the aircraft become an extension of her intention. At 4,000 feet, she released. The bomb fell away clean, and she executed a vertical pull that crushed her into the seat with 7 gs of force. Behind her, the explosion turned insurgent positions into memory. Ahead of her, the radio erupted with grateful voices from men who just learned they weren't going to die today. Good hit, Revenant, damn good hit. She didn't celebrate. She was already scanning for the next threat, the next emergency, the next moment where her skills stood between life and death. That was the thing about being Revenant. She always came back, and she never came back empty-handed. Back on the carrier that night, the ready room was thick with the smell of coffee and jet fuel. Her squadron commander, a grizzled O5 named Tors, found her reviewing gun camera footage. "You know," he said, settling into the chair beside her, "when you first reported aboard, half the guys thought you'd wash out in a month." She didn't look up from the screen. "I know. They don't think that anymore." "I know that too." Her tone wasn't cocky. It was simply factual, the way someone might observe the color of the sky or the temperature of the air. She'd proven herself 100 times over, but she knew the proving never really ended. Not when you were different. Not when your presence in the cockpit challenged assumptions that had calcified over decades. Tors leaned back, studying her profile in the monitor's glow. "What drives you, Castellanos? Most of us, we fly because we love it. But you fly like you're settling a score with God himself." She finally met his eyes, and for just a moment the armor cracked. "Maybe I am, sir." He didn't push. Command was knowing when to probe and when to leave things alone. But he filed the comment away, adding it to the growing list of details that made Revenant one of the most complicated pilots he'd ever led. What Tors didn't know, what nobody knew except Myra herself, was that every mission was atonement. Every bomb dropped, every target destroyed, every American life saved was her way of buying back something she'd lost years before in a training accident that killed her wingman. She'd been cleared of wrongdoing. The investigation had been thorough and conclusive, but guilt doesn't read reports, and forgiveness doesn't flow from official findings. So she flew. The deployment continued through summer, a rhythm of missions and maintenance, briefings and debriefings. Myra became the pilot everyone wanted on their wing, not the most naturally talented. That honor belonged to a hotshot named Cutter who flew with instinct, but the most reliable. When the mission was critical and the margins were thin, they called Revenant. She'd deliver every single time. It was late August when she met Captain Lucas Brennan. He wasn't a pilot. He was a Navy SEAL, call sign Bravo 6, and he walked into the ready room with the quiet confidence of someone who'd learned that loudness and competence rarely occupied the same space. He was there to brief the air wing on an upcoming operation, something classified enough that half the room was cleared before he began speaking. Myra stayed. Her clearances ran deep. "We're going after a high-value target in the Petch Valley," Brennan explained, laser pointer dancing across the map. "Insertion at 0300, extraction at first light. We'll need close air support standing by. This is a capture mission, but if it goes kinetic, we'll need precise fire. The compound is in the middle of a village. Civilian casualties would be catastrophic." "Who's primary CAS?" someone asked. Brennan's eyes found Myra's across the room. "I requested Revenant." The room went quiet. It wasn't unusual for ground forces to request specific pilots, but it was unusual for SEALs to know squadron call signs well enough to ask for them by name. Tors raised an eyebrow but said nothing. This wasn't his call. "Any reason?" Myra asked, her voice level. "You don't miss," Brennan said simply. "I've read the reports from every mission you've flown this deployment. You put warheads on foreheads without hitting anyone you don't mean to hit. That's what I need." She nodded once. "You'll have it." After the briefing, Brennan found her by the coffee station. Up close, she could see the wear on him, The permanent sunburn, the small scars, the eyes that had seen things that couldn't be unseen. He looked like what he was, a professional warrior at the absolute peak of his profession. "Thank you," he said, "for taking this." "It's my job," she replied, pouring coffee that had been sitting too long and tasted like burnt regret. "It's more than that." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I've been doing this a long time. I've worked with a lot of pilots. Most of them are good, some are great, but you're different. You fly like there's no margin for error because you know there isn't one. You fly like lives depend on you." "They do," she said quietly. "I know, that's why I asked for you." He extended his hand. "Looking forward to working with you, Revenant." She shook it, his grip firm without being aggressive. "Call me Myra." "Lucas, my friends call me Brennan." He smiled then, just slightly. "Try to keep me alive out there." "That's the plan," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. She didn't know then that this handshake was the beginning of something that would redefine everything she thought she understood about trust, partnership, and loss. She didn't know that Lucas Brennan would become the person who finally understood why she flew the way she did, or that he'd be the one to show her that atonement could look like something other than punishment. She just knew that she had a mission, and she would execute it flawlessly, because that's what Revenant did. The operation launched at 02:30. Myra sat in her cockpit on the carrier deck, the night air thick with salt and jet fuel. Her aircraft, side number 412, was loaded with precision-guided munitions and 500 rounds of 20mm ammunition. Behind her, the ocean stretched to infinity, black on black. Ahead, the mountains of Afghanistan waited with the patience of stone. "Revenant Tower, you're cleared for launch. Good hunting." "Copy, Tower." She ran through her final checks with mechanical precision, each switch and button an old friend. The catapult officer gave the signal, and she saluted, then braced. 2 seconds later, the cat fired and the world compressed into pure acceleration. 0 to 150 knots in 2 seconds, the carrier deck falling away beneath her as she climbed into darkness. The transit took 40 minutes. She flew in total blackness, navigation lights off, her position known only to the carrier's air controllers and the AWACS orbiting somewhere above. At her mission altitude, the stars were so bright they looked close enough to touch. She'd always loved this part, the solitude, the silence broken only by radio chatter and the steady roar of her engines. Up here, nothing else existed. No past, no guilt, no questions she couldn't answer. "Revenant Bravo 6, we're 10 minutes from insertion. Establish holding pattern at coordinates we briefed." "Copy, Bravo 6, moving to station." His voice was calm, almost casual, as if he were discussing the weather instead of leading a dozen men into a compound where they'd be outnumbered and outgunned. She reached her holding pattern and began her racetrack circuit, 8,000 feet above the Petch Valley. Below, she could see nothing but darkness, but she knew the terrain from memory, ridgelines and villages, rivers and roads. She'd studied every satellite image, memorized every landmark. If Brennan needed her, she'd be ready. The next 20 minutes were textbook. The SEAL team infiltrated quietly, moved through the village like ghosts, and breached the compound without firing a shot. She listened to their tactical chatter, the clipped professional exchanges that told her everything was going according to plan. Then, right at the moment of capture, everything went wrong. "Contact taking fire from multiple positions. We need CAS, we need it now." Brennan's voice had lost its calm, replaced by the sharp edge of combat. Myra was already rolling in. "Copy, coming in hot, mark your position." "IR strobe on the roof. Hostiles are in buildings east and south. Danger close." She acquired the strobe through her targeting pod, saw the muzzle flashes from the surrounding structures. The geometry was terrible, friendlies in the center, enemies on 3 sides, civilians likely everywhere. This wasn't a bombing run. This was surgery with explosives. "Bravo 6, Revenant, I need you to mark the eastern building. One mark, most dangerous threat." East building marked. A laser designator painted the target, invisible to everyone except her pod. She lined up the shot, compensating for wind, altitude, and the movement of men who didn't know they had seconds left to live. Her finger hovered over the release button. One mistake here and she'd kill Americans. One hesitation and the Americans would die anyway. She pressed. The GBU dropped clean, tracked true, and detonated exactly where she'd aimed it. The eastern building disappeared in a flash of light and overpressure. Before the debris finished falling, she was already acquiring the southern target, Brennan's team still pinned and taking fire. Southern building, same drill, mark it. Marked, the laser shifted. Second bomb away. Second building gone. Silence on the radio for 3 heartbeats, then Brennan's voice, breathing hard but alive. That's a kill, Revenant. Hostiles neutralized. You just saved our lives. She didn't respond immediately. She was scanning for secondary threats, making sure nothing else was moving toward the compound. Only when she was certain did she key her mic. Happy to help, Bravo 6. Get your package and get out. I'll stay overhead. Roger that, moving to extract. She orbited for another 30 minutes while the SEALs moved to their landing zone and lifted off in their helos. Only when they were clear and heading back to base did she turn for home. The sun was rising as she approached the carrier, painting the ocean in shades of gold and crimson. She trapped on deck as dawn broke fully, the arrest cables catching her jet with familiar violence. After the debrief, she found Brennan in the corridor outside the SCIF. He looked exhausted but whole. When he saw her, something crossed his face that she couldn't quite name. "I owe you," he said simply. "You don't," she replied. "That's the job." "No," he shook his head. "That wasn't the job. That was artistry. I've never seen precision like that. You dropped bombs within 50 meters of our position in the dark. Most pilots wouldn't even attempt that shot." "Most pilots don't have to." She said it without ego, just fact. He studied her for a moment, then said something that would echo through the years that followed. "Whoever hurt you, whatever made you this way, I'm grateful to them. Because you're the reason 12 men are going home to their families today." She didn't know how to respond to that, so she just nodded and walked away. But the words stayed with her, working their way into the places where guilt had lived for so long. Maybe she wasn't just atoning. Maybe she was building something new. Over the next 6 weeks, Myra and Brennan worked together on 4 more operations. Each time, the pattern was the same: impossible situations, tight margins, and flawless execution. They developed an almost telepathic understanding, his needs anticipated by her positioning, her capabilities exploited by his planning. The rest of the task force began to notice. When Bravo 6 went out, Revenant went with him. It became an assumption, then a tradition, then something closer to superstition. Between missions, they talked. Not about the war, everyone talked about the war, but about the things that existed outside of it. He told her about growing up in Montana, about learning to hunt with his grandfather, about joining the Navy to see the world and finding he was good at the violence it sometimes required. She told him about Florida, about her father who'd been an Air Force mechanic, about the first time she'd seen a fighter jet and known with absolute certainty what she wanted to be. Neither of them talked about the deeper things. Not yet. Those conversations required trust that hadn't fully formed, but the foundation was being laid, one mission and one conversation at a time. The deployment ended in October. They said goodbye on the carrier deck, the sun setting behind them as the ship prepared to return to San Diego. "Stay safe out there," she told him, and meant it more than he probably understood. "You too," he replied. "When you're back stateside, look me up. I owe you about a dozen beers." "I'll hold you to that," she said, and they shook hands like professionals, nothing in the gesture revealing how much their partnership had come to mean. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. 3 months later, she got a message through official channels. Lucas Brennan had been shot down, not a pilot himself, but riding in a helicopter that had taken an RPG over Helmand Province. He was stateside now, recovering at Walter Reed. The message included his room number. She went, of course she went. He was sitting up when she arrived, his left leg in a complicated brace, his face thinner than she remembered. But his eyes were the same, sharp, aware, alive. When he saw her in the doorway, he smiled, and something in her chest that had been tight for months suddenly loosened. "Revenant," he said, "you came." "Of course I came." She pulled up a chair. "How bad?" "Could be worse. Shattered femur, some shrapnel, nothing that won't heal. The guys who didn't make it," he stopped, his jaw working. "3 good men." She understood. Survivor's guilt wore the same face whether you were a pilot or a SEAL. "I'm sorry." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the kind that exists between people who have seen each other at their worst and stuck around anyway. Then he said, "I thought about you when we went down. Thought how you would have handled it. You would have found a way to save everyone." "I'm not that good," she said quietly. "Yes, you are. You just don't let yourself believe it." He reached for the water on his bedside table, winced at the movement. She handed it to him. "Listen, I've been thinking. When I get cleared for duty again, they're probably going to put me behind a desk for a while. I hate desks. Most warriors do. But there's this program, joint training between special operations and naval aviation. They need senior guys to help run it. I'm thinking about putting in for it. Be stationed in California, near San Diego." She understood what he was asking without him having to say it directly. Near San Diego meant near her, meant more time together, meant the possibility of this partnership becoming something more permanent. The thought terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. "That sounds like a good fit," she said carefully. "You'd be good at teaching." "I'd be good at being near you," he said, all pretense abandoned. "These past few months I've realized something. You can spend your whole life being good at war, Myra, but that doesn't mean you're good at living. I want to learn how to do both. And I think maybe we could figure it out together." She wanted to say yes immediately, but the wounds were still too fresh, the guilt still too present. She thought about her wingman, about all the reasons she'd chosen to live behind armor. "I don't know if I'm ready for that." "I'm not asking you to be ready. I'm just asking you to think about it." He smiled then, gentle and genuine. "No pressure, but Revenant, the person who flies the way you do, who cares that much about keeping people alive, that person deserves to have a life of their own, not just a mission." She left without answering, but his words followed her home and settled into her thoughts like seeds in fertile ground. Over the next year, as his rehabilitation progressed and their friendship deepened through calls and visits, those seeds began to grow. Maybe he was right. Maybe she could be more than just her guilt. Maybe she could be someone who lived. They were married 18 months after his injury, a small ceremony on the beach with Tor's and Brennan's SEAL team in attendance. She wore her dress whites and he wore his, both of them covered in ribbons that testified to their service. When they exchanged vows, she promised to love him with the same precision she brought to everything else. He promised to give her a reason to want to come home. They kept both promises. For 3 years, they built a life that existed in the spaces between deployments. She continued to fly, racking up missions and hours, while he split time between training assignments and occasional operational rotations. They bought a small house near Coronado, the kind of place with a view of the ocean, and enough room for the family they talked about starting someday. When they were both home, the house filled with the kind of quiet happiness that people who have known war appreciate more than most. She got pregnant with their daughter on a rare month when both of their schedules aligned. They'd been trying for a while, and when the test came back positive, Brennan had lifted her off her feet and spun her around despite her protests, both of them laughing with the kind of joy that felt almost forbidden given what they did for a living. "We're going to be parents," he'd said, his forehead pressed against hers. "I'm going to be terrible at this," she'd replied, half joking. "No, you won't. You're good at everything." I'm good at flying. That's different than raising a child. He'd pulled back to look at her seriously. You're good at protecting people. You're good at staying calm when everything goes wrong. You're good at doing the impossible. That's pretty much all parenting is. She'd laughed despite herself, and let herself believe maybe he was right. Their daughter, Alina, was born on a Tuesday in March. Myra held her for the first time and felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of the world. This small person, impossibly fragile, was now the center of everything. Every decision, every risk, every mission would now be calculated against the weight of this tiny life depending on her. She has your eyes, Brennan said, looking over her shoulder at their daughter. She has your stubborn chin, Myra replied. They were both right. Alina was a perfect synthesis of them both, and for a while everything was exactly as it should be. Myra took maternity leave, and Brennan arranged his schedule to be home as much as possible. They learned parenthood together, stumbling through diaper changes and midnight feedings with the same teamwork they'd brought to combat operations. He'd take the 2 a.m. feeding, she'd handle 4. They'd compare notes at dawn like they were debriefing a mission, laughing at themselves for bringing military precision to infant care. When Alina was 4 months old, Myra returned to flying status. It was harder than she'd expected, leaving her daughter even for a training flight. But she was still a Navy pilot, and the Navy still needed her. She'd been promoted to lieutenant commander by then, her record too exemplary to ignore. They'd started talking about her taking a training command, maybe transitioning to a role that involved less deployment time. She was considering it, really considering it, because coming home mattered now in ways it never had before. Then came the call that shattered everything. Myra was in a debrief when her commanding officer entered the room, his face a mask of professional control that didn't quite hide the grief beneath. Everyone fell silent. A co didn't interrupt tactical debriefs unless something was catastrophically wrong. Lieutenant Commander Castellanos, he said quietly, I need you to come with me. She knew before he said the words. Some part of her had always known this day might come, had lived with the possibility the same way pilots live with the knowledge that every flight could be their last. But knowing it was possible and experiencing it were entirely different universes. Brennan's team had been conducting a raid in Syria. The intelligence had been solid, the planning meticulous, the execution textbook. But war doesn't care about meticulous planning. An IED had detonated during extraction, and Bravo 6, her husband, Alina's father, had taken the brunt of the blast protecting his men. He died instantly. That's what they told her, as if the speed of his death somehow made it better. The funeral was full military honors, the cemetery overlooking the Pacific. She stood in her dress whites, holding Alina, and watched them fold the flag with precise ceremony. When they presented it to her, she accepted it with the same mechanical efficiency she'd brought to every other impossible task in her life. This was just another mission. Get through the ceremony. Accept the condolences. Don't break where people can see. She didn't cry. Not during the service, not during the wake, not during the long night after when Alina finally fell asleep and she was alone with the silence. The tears wouldn't come. Instead, there was just emptiness where her heart used to be, and the growing understanding that she now had to figure out how to be enough for a daughter who'd never remember her father. The Navy offered her leave. She took 2 weeks, then went back to work because staying home meant drowning in the absence of him. Her mother came to help with Alina, moving into the guest room and taking over the logistics of infant care, while Myra threw herself back into flying with the intensity of someone trying to outrun grief. It almost worked. In the cockpit, she could focus on procedures and targets and the immediate demands of keeping an aircraft in controlled flight. The grief couldn't follow her to 40,000 feet, but it was always waiting when she landed, patient and hungry, ready to consume whatever pieces of her the day hadn't already taken. Her squadron mates tried to help. Tours assigned her to training runs, nothing too demanding, giving her space to readjust. Other pilots offered to babysit, to bring meals, to just sit with her in silence if that's what she needed. She appreciated it all and accepted none of it. She'd learned long ago how to function alone, and grief was just another enemy to fight in solitude. 6 months after Brennan's death, she was back on deployment. Her mother had agreed to stay with Alina full-time, becoming the primary caregiver while Myra went back to doing the only thing she knew how to do, flying into danger and bringing people home alive. It wasn't fair to Alina, she knew that. But fairness had died in Syria along with her husband, and all she had left was duty. The deployment was supposed to be routine. Combat operations had wound down, and most of her flights were show-of-force missions and training exercises with coalition partners. She flew with mechanical precision, not taking risks but not shying from them either. Some part of her had broken when Brennan died, and while she'd glued the pieces back together well enough to function, everyone could see the cracks, including Tors, who pulled her aside after a particularly aggressive training run. "Myra, I need you to talk to someone. The chaplain, the psychologist, a friend, someone." "I'm fine, sir." "No, you're not, and I'm not judging you for it. What you're going through, no one should have to carry that alone." "I've been carrying things alone my whole life, sir. I'm good at it." "That doesn't mean you should have to." He paused, searching for the right words. "Brennan was my friend too. If he were here, he'd tell you the same thing. You're allowed to grieve. You're allowed to not be okay." "If I'm not okay, I can't fly. If I can't fly, I'm nothing." The words came out harder than she'd intended, but they were true. Flying was all she had left. Take that away and she'd have to confront the wreckage of everything else. Tors looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, but the offer stands. Any time you need to talk, my door's open." She thanked him and left, and continued to not talk to anyone about the howling void where her heart used to be. 3 weeks later, everything came apart. She was flying close air support for a Marine unit conducting vehicle checkpoint operations when the call came through. Troops in contact, heavy casualties, urgent assistance required. She responded without hesitation, arriving on station to find chaos. "Revenant Ghost 3-1. We've got wounded, surrounded position taking heavy fire. Multiple casualties, including children. It's a goddamn nightmare." Children. The word hit her like a physical blow. Suddenly she wasn't over some nameless village in the Middle East. She was thinking about Alina, about every child who would grow up without a parent, about all the ways the world was unnecessarily cruel. "Copy Ghost 3-1, what do you need?" "Danger close fire on these coordinates. They're in the buildings surrounding our position, but there are civilians mixed in. I can't tell who's hostile and who's, Jesus, contact left, taking fire." She acquired the target area through her pod. The tactical situation was a nightmare. Insurgents firing from civilian structures, Marines pinned in the center, non-combatants running through the streets trying to escape. There was no clean shot. Any weapon she employed would kill people who weren't part of this fight. "Ghost 3-1, Revenant. I need better target designation. I can't fire on buildings with civilian signatures." "We don't have time. They're going to overrun us." She stared at the targeting screen, her finger hovering over the trigger, and for the first time in her career, she froze. All she could see was Alina's face. All she could think about was some other pilot, in some other war, making this same calculation over a village where her daughter was sleeping. The mathematics of acceptable losses suddenly felt impossible. "Revenant, where's that fire support?" The Marine's voice was desperate now. "Stand by." She was scanning frantically for alternatives, for any way to save the Marines without killing the innocents. There had to be an answer. There was always an answer. She just had to find it. "We can't stand by. We're taking casualties." Her hands moved across the controls, but her mind was stuck, trapped in a loop of impossible choices. This was the trolley problem made real: act and kill innocents, or do nothing and watch the Marines die. Both choices led to death. Both choices made her complicit. Revenant, we need you. She made a decision. Acquired the building with the most obvious muzzle flashes, the one furthest from civilian signatures. Released one precision munition, watched it track true and impact. The building collapsed, fire ceased from that position. But the Marines were still pinned, still taking casualties, still needing her. Good hit, again, same thing, eastern building. She lined up the shot, but her hands were shaking now, her breathing ragged. Alina's face kept flashing in her mind, superimposed over the thermal images of people running through streets. Someone's daughter was down there. Someone's son. Someone who'd be an orphan if she pulled the trigger. The eastern building exploded without her assistance. For a confused moment, she thought she'd released without realizing it. Then she saw the secondary explosions, ammunition cooking off. The insurgents had rigged it as a weapons cache, and someone's small arms fire had found something volatile. Buildings down, we're moving to extract. She provided cover as they pulled back, but she was flying on autopilot now, her mind somewhere else entirely. When they were clear and she turned for home, she realized she was crying. The tears she hadn't been able to shed for Brennan were finally coming, triggered by a combat situation that had cracked the armor she'd built around her grief. She landed the aircraft safely, went through the post-flight procedures with shaking hands, and walked directly to the chaplain's office. When he opened the door, she said simply, "I need help." It was the hardest thing she'd ever done, harder than any combat mission, harder even than Brennan's funeral. But she said it, and in saying it began the long process of putting herself back together. The chaplain, a soft-spoken man named Williams who'd been a Marine before taking his vows, listened without judgment as she told him everything. About Brennan, about Alina, about the guilt she'd carried since her wingman's death, about the impossible mathematics of war and the weight of all the lives she'd ended and saved. She talked for hours, words spilling out like water from a broken dam, and he just listened. "What you're describing," he finally said when she'd exhausted herself, "is moral injury. It's different from PTSD, though they often go together. It's what happens when the things you have to do conflict with your deepest values, when being good at your job means doing things that hurt your soul." "How do I fix it?" she asked. "You don't fix it. You learn to carry it differently. You forgive yourself for being human in situations that demanded you be something more." He leaned forward, his eyes kind. "Lieutenant Commander, you've spent years being perfect because you thought that was the only way to atone for your mistakes. But perfection isn't the same as healing. And you can't be what Alina needs if you're running yourself into the ground trying to be what everyone else needs." "I don't know how to be anything else." "Then maybe it's time to learn." She started therapy, real therapy, with a psychologist who specialized in combat trauma. It was brutal work, excavating all the places where she'd buried pain instead of processing it. But slowly, incrementally, she began to feel less like a machine built for war and more like a person who happened to be good at it. She also made a decision. When the deployment ended, she requested a transfer to a training command. No more combat operations. No more carrier deployments. She'd teach the next generation of pilots how to survive in the chaos she'd mastered. It was the right choice for Alina, and after years of ignoring her own needs, maybe it was the right choice for herself too. Torres approved the transfer without question. "You've given enough, Myra, more than enough. Go home, raise your daughter, teach kids how to be half as good as you are." "Thank you, sir. Thank you for everything. Brennan was lucky to have you, Alina's lucky to have you, and the Navy, well, the Navy's been damn lucky too." She returned stateside to find Alina had started walking in her absence. Her mother showed her videos, and Myra watched her daughter taking uncertain steps across the living room floor and felt the full weight of what she'd been missing. No more. She'd given the Navy and the country years of her life. Now it was Alina's turn to have a mother who was actually present. The training command was based in Meridian, Mississippi, far from the ocean and the carriers and the life she'd known. She taught young pilots the basics of carrier operations, how to land on a pitching deck at night, how to stay calm when everything went wrong. She was good at it, her own hard-won experience translating into lessons that kept students alive. But she was restless. Teaching was important, but it wasn't the same as doing. She missed the edge, the precision, the feeling of being the difference between life and death. Part of her would always be Revenant, the pilot who never missed, and that part chafed at the safety of training missions. When Alina was 3, Myra made another change. She left active duty and joined the reserves, taking a civilian job as a nurse at a military hospital. It was a drastic shift from the cockpit to the ward, but it made sense in ways that surprised her. Medicine was its own kind of precision flying, its own form of keeping people alive. And it meant she could be home every night, could tuck Alina in and read her stories and actually be present for the thousand small moments that made up a childhood. She went to nursing school while working part-time at the hospital, her military medical training giving her a head start. It was hard, juggling classes and shifts and parenting, but she'd done harder things. And there was something satisfying about using her hands to heal instead of flying aircraft that carried weapons. Balance, maybe, or atonement of a different kind. Years passed. Alina grew from toddler to child, smart and willful and carrying traces of both her parents in her features and temperament. Myra dated occasionally but never seriously. Part of her was still married to Brennan, still wearing the ring on a chain under her scrubs. She'd loved once, deeply and completely, and that felt like enough for one lifetime. She was working a double shift the day Admiral Grayson walked into her ward. She didn't recognize him initially. Flag officers didn't usually memorize the names of reserve pilots who'd left active duty, but he recognized her. Or rather, he recognized something in the way she moved, and asked her name, and learned he was talking to a legend he thought had disappeared. Now he stood in front of her, this 4-star admiral with enough ribbons to outfit a parade, looking at her like she was a ghost. "Revenant," he said again, the name heavy with recognition. "We thought you'd left the service entirely." "I did, for the most part. I fly once a month to keep my certification current, but this is my real job now." "Why?" The question wasn't judgmental, just curious. "You were one of the finest pilots I've ever seen. The records from your combat deployments, Myra, you were extraordinary. Why walk away from that?" She could have given him the simple answer. Alina, single motherhood, the need for stability, all true and all insufficient. Instead, she told him the truth. "Because I was afraid if I kept flying, I'd forget why I started. I'd become the mission instead of the person doing it. And my daughter deserves a mother who's more than just really good at her job." He nodded slowly, processing this. Then, "I'm here because we're standing up a new program. A joint initiative between Special Operations and Naval Aviation, training the next generation of close air support pilots. We need someone who's done it at the highest level, who can teach precision and judgment under pressure. We need someone who understands that the point of all this isn't the flying, it's the lives we save." "Sounds like a good program," she said carefully. "I want you to run it." The offer hit her like turbulence, unexpected and disorienting. "Admiral, I appreciate the confidence, but I've been out of tactical aviation for years. There are active-duty pilots with more recent experience." "I don't want recent experience. I want the right teacher. Someone who can show these kids that being great isn't about being fearless, it's about being afraid and doing it anyway. Someone who understands the weight of what we do." He paused. "I read the report from your last combat deployment. I know what happened in that engagement and I know what you did after. That's not failure, Commander. That's wisdom." She wanted to refuse. The offer meant going back to a world she'd deliberately left, meant being Revenant again instead of just Myra. But there was something appealing about the idea of shaping how the next generation learned to do this impossible job. Maybe she could teach them to be excellent without destroying themselves in the process. "I need to think about it," she said. "Take your time, but Myra, the Navy needs you. More importantly, there are pilots who need what you have to teach. Think about that." He left and she stood in the corridor trying to process what had just happened. On one hand, it was everything she'd walked away from. On the other, it was a chance to mean something again in the world she'd loved before grief had reshaped everything. That night, after Alina was asleep, she sat on the porch and thought about Brennan, about what he'd say if he were here. She knew the answer. He'd tell her to do what made her happy. He'd remind her that she was allowed to be more than her wounds. He'd probably make a joke about her being too stubborn to stay retired. She accepted the position 2 days later.